This wasn't just horror. This was theology carved in flesh and whispered through steel. Hellraiser didn't want to scare you. It wanted to seduce you into questioning where pain ends and where desire begins. Released in 1987, written and directed by Clive Barker, Hellraiser was unlike anything that came before it. It didn't rely on jump scares or mass killers. Instead, it offered an invitation, a key disguised as a puzzle box, a ritual masquerading as a film, a world where pleasure and agony weren't opposites, they were soulmates. At the center of that world were the Cenobites, beings not from hell, but from somewhere colder, stranger, governed by laws that have nothing to do with morality. They don't kill out of rage or revenge, they respond to longing yort. And among them stood the lead Cenobite, later named Pinhead, quiet, composed, quoting scripture not from any holy book, but from some ancient, brutal gospel carved into human nerves. He doesn't scream, he doesn't chase, he waits for you to open the box. But Hellraiser wasn't just terrifying. It was intimate. It revealed as much about its creator's desires as it did about its audience's. Behind every chain, every drop of blood, every whispered line, there was something personal, something secret. These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about Hellraiser. Some are disturbing, others are tragic, and a few were never meant to be known at all. Fact Hasson. Pinhead was never meant to speak, and that changed everything. In Clive Barker's earliest vision, the Cenobites weren't supposed to say a single word. They were designed as living nightmares, part sadist, part priest, entirely silent. Their power was visual. Their terror was in the restraint. Pinhead, credited only as the lead Cenobite, was just another faceless entity in the background of torment. Until Doug Bradley, a classically trained actor and longtime friend of Barker, delivered a test reading so eerily composed that Barker paused, listened, and rewrote entire scenes. Suddenly, the silent priest of pain began to speak, not with screams, but with a voice like falling knives, calm, rhythmic, ritualistic. Lines were rewritten on set to match this tone. Poetic, philosophical, chilling. Pinhead didn't just talk, he preached. But the studio pushed back. They wanted a growl, not a sermon. They feared American audiences wouldn't respond to a villain quoting Shakespeare. They even tested alternate dubbed voices, gruffer, simpler, less intelligent. In the end, Barker refused to compromise. Bradley's performance stayed intact, and what began as a mute background figure became one of horror cinema's most unforgettable and most quotable icons. Pinhead was never meant to speak, but once he did, no one else in the room mattered. Fact #2. Frank's resurrection was built from flesh, some of it real. The resurrection of Frank remains one of the most viscerally disturbing scenes in horror history. Bones cracking, muscles forming, nerves twitching beneath a layer of glistening, raw tissue. It looks too real. Because parts of it were. With a tight budget and no room for CGI, Barker's effects team turned to old-school methods and then went further. They visited local butchers. Slabs of cow organs and offal were purchased, chilled, and nailed into the attic set. These were then layered with latex and gel, lit carefully to blend seamlessly into the practical puppet. As the reconstitution unfolds, blood doesn't drip, it clings. Flesh doesn't grow, it pulses. The stench of rotting meat under hot lights became so unbearable that several crew members vomited or left the set entirely. Masks were handed out. Others refused to return until the scene was over. But the most disturbing part? No one remembers exactly when the last chunk of real meat was removed. It may have stayed there for days, quietly decomposing beneath the boards. In a film about blurred boundaries, even the set couldn't tell where fiction ended and flesh began. Fact #3. Pinhead's design was born from ritual, not horror tropes. The grid of nails embedded into Pinhead's skull wasn't just grotesque design, it was spiritual geometry. Barker drew from two radically different sources: ancient African scarification rituals and the underground S&M clubs of 1982 London. From tribal culture, he borrowed symmetry, permanence, and meaning carved into the body. From the BDSM scene, he took restraint, leather, polished steel, and the sanctity of submission. Combined, these formed something new. A monster who didn't wear horror on the outside, but whose very existence embodied control, silence, and transcendence through agony. Pinhead was never meant to scream or slash. He was meant to stand still and terrify you with the weight of everything he represented: pain, order, obedience, desire. The twist? The MPAA wasn't shaken by the violence. What unsettled them was his poise. They didn't understand a monster who didn't growl, who didn't enjoy cruelty, but offered it as a sacred transaction. They feared not what Pinhead did, but what he meant. Fact #4. The puzzle box was a mystery even to the people who built it. The Le Marchand's box, elegant, ominous, and deceptively small, has become one of the most iconic objects in horror. But here's the strange truth. No one involved in Hellraiser fully knew how it worked, not even Clive Barker. He designed it not as a device with rules, but as a metaphor, a puzzle that tests not intellect, but desire. It wasn't about solving, it was about wanting to solve. Wanting too much. To make it function on screen, the art department created a mechanical prop with internal hinges and rotating panels. But it was so fragile and finicky that only one crew member could operate it properly. During filming, that technician would crouch below frame, manipulating the box by hand as actors pretended to do the work. Some scenes had to be filmed in reverse, then played forward to simulate the cube opening. And even then, it was often unclear what it had done. A light flashes, chains fly, a door appears. Was it magic? Machinery? A hallucination? And that's the point. Barker never gave it rules. The studio wanted logic. Fans demanded lore. But the truth was simpler and more sinister. The box doesn't need to make sense. It only needs you to reach for it. Fact hash 5. Julia was supposed to be the real villain, not Pinhead. In Barker's original vision, the franchise wouldn't revolve around Pinhead. It would follow Julia, the cold, calculating woman who lures men to their deaths to resurrect her undead lover. She wasn't possessed. She wasn't cursed. She chose to kill. That's what made her terrifying. She was desire, weaponized, love corrupted into obsession. Barker once called her Lady Macbeth dipped in blood and wrapped in silk. The plan was for Julia to survive Hellraiser and become the franchise's driving force, even transforming into a Cenobite herself. Hellbound, Hellraiser 2 was initially written around her evolution. Posters teased her return. But actress Claire Higgins was done. She hated horror. The shoot had drained her emotionally. She declined to continue. And the studio? They saw Pinhead gaining traction with fans. He was marketable, visual, quote-worthy. So Julia was killed off. Her arc ended early, her role minimized in later sequels. And horror lost the chance to center its mythology on a villain motivated not by evil, but by longing. Fact hash 6. The Cenobites were inspired by Barker's personal fetishes openly. Hellraiser wasn't a horror story dressed in leather. It was autobiography in disguise. Before becoming a filmmaker, Clive Barker was immersed in London's underground S&M scene. Not as an observer, as a participant. He explored the world of ritual submission, pain as ecstasy, and the sacred power dynamics of trust and domination. What he found wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. In the Cenobites, he translated that experience into horror iconography. The leather, the hooks, the restraint, they weren't costumes, they were uniforms of belief. Pinhead isn't a killer, he's a priest. He doesn't punish. He delivers what was requested, and he does it without judgment. Barker later admitted that the film's central message wasn't metaphorical at all. The Cenobites don't stand in for trauma or guilt. They're not symbols. They're what happens when desire refuses to stop at the edge of pain. Most horror asks, "What are you afraid of?" Hellraiser asks something worse. What would you do if no one ever said no? Fact hash 7. A scene so disturbing it was erased, not just cut. There was a moment in Hellraiser that even the studio couldn't stomach. A scene that blurred horror and intimacy so completely it unsettled the crew more than the Cenobites ever did. It featured Frank raw, skinless, glistening, crawling toward Julia, not with fear, but with longing. His hands left streaks of blood on her dress as he whispered promises of desire. There were no chains, no screams, just a slow, sensual approach wrapped in rot. Test audiences walked out. One executive called it pornographic, but for nerves instead of flesh. Barker agreed to cut it, but he didn't delete it, he preserved the reel, hoping to restore it someday. That reel is now missing. Not destroyed. Missing. No digital copy exists. No documentation. It might sit mislabeled in a British vault, or it might be in the hands of a private collector who doesn't even know what they have. The most psychologically terrifying moment in the film may now live only in rumor and in Barker's memory. Sometimes, the most horrifying thing about a film is knowing that something worse was filmed and then buried. If you enjoyed the video, please comment with number 1. If the video wasn't good enough, please comment with number 2. This will help us improve the quality of our future videos. Thank you. Fact hashite. Doug Bradley was so invisible, no one spoke to him. Doug Bradley gave one of the most iconic performances in horror history. But during the first week of filming, he was almost completely ignored. Bradley had made a personal choice. He didn't want to confuse the illusion of Pinhead by being seen out of makeup on set. So he stayed away during breaks, kept to himself, never appeared in costume unless needed. The result? The cast and crew didn't recognize him. Worse, they didn't even acknowledge him. During lunch breaks, he ate alone. No one sat with him. Some assumed he was part of the lighting crew or a new PA. Bradley later admitted the isolation hurt but also helped. When he stepped onto set in full prosthetics, surrounded by people who had barely looked at him for a week, he felt like a stranger, a presence, an outsider. And that eerie, quiet menace? It wasn't acting. It was how the room already treated him. Fact #9. Frank's rebirth was made of condoms, jelly, and shadow. The grotesque beauty of Frank's resurrection scene wasn't just performance, it was a masterpiece of physical effects. But the materials used weren't high-end Hollywood tech. They were things you could buy at a pharmacy. To create the illusion of wet, stretching skin, the FX team used latex condoms, torn and layered over armatures, giving the surface an organic stretchiness. They smeared the surface with KY jelly, mixed with food coloring and corn syrup for that deep, red-black sheen. But what made it truly disturbing was light and restraint. They didn't show everything. Shadows obscured details. The human mind filled in the gaps and made it worse than any prosthetic could. It wasn't the budget that made it terrifying, it was the limits. And today, after decades of digital gore, Frank's rebirth still feels more alive because it was built from the mundane and lit like a nightmare. Fact #0. The MPAA didn't fear violence, they feared intimacy. When Hellraiser was submitted to the MPAA, Clive Barker expected pushback. He anticipated objections over flayed skin, hooks, and mutilation. But the censors didn't flinch at gore. What disturbed them was the wetness. They described it as excessive moisture, not blood in motion, but blood in texture. Scenes where liquid clung to skin, where the camera lingered, where the boundaries between flesh and fluid felt too close. Moments like Frank licking blood from the wooden floor weren't banned for being graphic. They were cut because they were too intimate, too tactile. In total, only a few seconds were removed. A lingering shot here, a slow caress there, but it changed everything. And that's what scared the MPAA. Hellraiser didn't just show pain, it suggested that someone, somewhere, might want it. It didn't scream, it invited, and that was far more dangerous. Fact #9. Chatterer was blind and that made him real. The Chatterer Cenobite, all teeth, no eyes, was meant to be unsettling. But the actor behind the mask, Nicholas Vince, didn't have to act discomfort. He was suffering. The full-head latex prosthetic had no vision holes. It was sealed tight, suffocating, glued to his face and neck with no cooling system. He was completely blind. The clicking teeth were controlled by muscle tension in his jaw. Every step Vince took on set was a guess. He couldn't see marks, props, or even lights. In one scene, he tripped and smashed into a metal frame. He bled. He didn't complain. He stayed in character. When asked how he managed it, Vince simply replied, "He doesn't need to see you. He already knows." And that's why Chatterer remains so haunting. He isn't chasing you. He's already here. Fact #10. Julia's fate changed because of one sentence. Originally, Julia was meant to survive. She was going to evolve possibly into the franchise's main villain. But on the day of her death scene, something shifted. Claire Higgins, exhausted, emotionally raw from the role, turned to Clive Barker and said quietly, "Kill her, let her go." Barker agreed. On set, that very moment, the statue scene was rewritten, reshot, and restructured. The moment of transformation became a moment of abandonment. No grand payoff, no rising arc, just a scream, a statue, and silence. And with that, Hellraiser lost its original queen and birthed a new king in Pinhead. Julia didn't die because the story demanded it. She died because the actress couldn't carry it anymore. Fact #3. The Cenobites had no names until the audience gave them one. When Hellraiser first hit screens, the Cenobites arrived with no names, no labels, no origins. In the credits, they were listed clinically: lead Cenobite, female Cenobite, Chatterer, Butterball. They were function, not identity. Clive Barker envisioned them that way, anonymous priests of sensation. They didn't need titles. They weren't characters. They were forces. But fans couldn't let it stay that way. At early horror conventions and in fanzines, they started giving them names. The lead Cenobite became Pinhead, a nickname born out of simplicity, maybe even mockery. Barker hated it. To him, it stripped the figure of dignity. He preferred the Hell Priest, a title that suggested ancient power, not gimmick. But it was too late. The name caught fire. Merchandise followed. Posters, action figures, spin-offs. Pinhead became official, whether Barker liked it or not. And here lies the paradox. A creature who preached the destruction of individuality, who tore apart flesh to erase ego, became famous because fans gave him an identity. Pinhead didn't ask for a name. We gave him one. And in doing so, we made him ours. Fact Hasson 4. The score was written before the film was even finished. Composer Christopher Young didn't wait for the final cut. He began scoring Hellraiser while it was still in pieces, editing incomplete, scenes missing, no clear tone yet established. All he had were sketches, scripts, and a single instruction from Clive Barker. It should feel like a love story that ends in hell. Young leaned into that contradiction. Instead of typical horror stabs and jolts, he composed sweeping orchestral passages, strings that soared, choirs that wept, melodies that mourned instead of screamed. The music treated the Cenobites not as monsters, but as fallen angels. The box wasn't a weapon, it was a sacrament. And the strangest thing, when the footage finally came together, the music fit perfectly, as if the score had always been there, waiting for the images to catch up. It's not that the film was cut to the music. It's that the music already understood what the film was trying to become. Fact Hasson 5. The studio tried to replace the cast with American voices. Despite being a British production, Hellraiser was destined for American theaters, and the distributors had doubts. They feared US audiences wouldn't connect with the British accents, that the delivery felt too distant, too proper. Their solution? Redub the entire film. Voice actors were brought in. Entire scenes were re-recorded with American voices. Even Doug Bradley's lines were nearly replaced. The lead Cenobite, calm, articulate, terrifying, was almost turned into a grunting monster with a flat accent. The dubbed versions lacked rhythm. They lost the poetry. They stripped the characters of weight. It was horror made generic. Barker fought hard. He restored as much of the original audio as he could, but some dubs remained. A few minor characters still speak in voices that don't match their lips. You can see it, you can feel it. A film about the obliteration of identity nearly had its voice erased, not by demons, but by marketing executives. Fact Hasson X. They ran out of blood, so they invented their own recipe for horror. There's a certain look to blood in Hellraiser, not bright red, not theatrical. It's thicker, darker. It stains the air, not just the floor. That wasn't a creative choice. It was a crisis. Midway through production, the team exhausted their entire supply of commercial stage blood. Delays would have killed the momentum. Barker refused to stop, so the effects team improvised. They began mixing their own formula: Kensington golden syrup, dish soap, instant coffee for depth, red and brown food coloring. In some batches, they added flour to give it weight, something that didn't spray, but clung. It was messy. It was inconsistent. It stained costumes permanently and warped props. But under the camera's light, especially with shadows and slow movements, it looked almost organic. In one scene, a crew member sliced his own finger during setup. Instead of bandaging it, he studied how the real blood pooled, using it to improve the mixture. Hellraiser didn't use the best materials. It used obsession. And when you look at those streaks of blood on the wall, just know, at least some of them were real. Fact Hasson 7. Barker wrote parts of the film hours before they were shot. Clive Barker arrived on set with a vision but not a finished script. Scenes were outlined, dialogue was sketched. But the emotion, the nuance, that came late at night, under a dim lamp, as Barker hunched over his manual typewriter, rewriting. Sometimes it was a line, sometimes an entire character's arc. Actors would arrive on set to find their scenes rewritten overnight, motivations shifted, dialogue restructured, tone inverted. Doug Bradley once recalled receiving new pages the morning of a shoot that completely redefined Pinhead's attitude toward a scene. Claire Higgins was given monologues rewritten between takes. It was chaotic, exhausting, but it created something strange, a fever dream logic, where scenes didn't feel planned, but discovered in the moment. That's why Hellraiser feels both structured and fragmented, like something ritualistic, improvised under pressure, half-written by instinct. The film wasn't just directed by Barker, it was bled out of him, one page at a time. Fact Hasson 8. A real human skull might be in the film and no one's sure where. This is the kind of rumor that horror thrives on half-truth, half-urban legend. But several crew members have hinted at it over the years. At least one skeletal prop used in the attic scenes may have been a real human skull. According to the story, a member of the art department had access to anatomical suppliers, mostly for medical training props. One day, a donation appeared, aged, unmarked, unnervingly realistic. It was used in wide shots, possibly placed among bones or partially hidden. Barker neither confirmed nor denied it. One interview had him pause, smile slightly, and say, "We used what we had." To this day, no one has located the skull or confirmed its origin. The production was fast, underfunded, and full of improvisation. Props were reused, labeled, lost. So yes, it's possible a real human remnant made it into Hellraiser. And the most disturbing part? You may have already seen it and never realized. Fact Hassananine. The original title was too honest for theaters to handle. Before it became Hellraiser, Clive Barker's script had a different name, one that wasn't poetic, mysterious, or subtle. The title was Sadomasochists from Beyond the Grave. Barker wasn't joking. To him, it was an accurate reflection of the story's core, a tale of spiritual extremism, where pain was sacred and desire was a trap. He didn't want to hide that. He wanted to confront audiences with it. The studio, unsurprisingly, recoiled. Executives refused to market a film with that name. Posters were out of the question. Ads would be rejected. Focus groups laughed. It sounded like a parody or worse, a late-night sexploitation flick. Several alternatives were floated. The Hellbound Heart, same as Barker's novella, Hellbound Demonic. But none had the weight Barker wanted. Finally, someone it's still unclear who suggested Hellraiser. Simple, bold. It carried the essence, but hid the discomfort. And it worked? The film was released under that title. It became a cult classic. But Barker never forgot the rejection of his original vision. Because Sadomasochists from Beyond the Grave wasn't just provocative, it was honest. It said what the film truly was, and maybe that was too much truth for audiences to face. Fact #20. Pinhead's voice was nearly replaced with a growl. Doug Bradley's voice, calm, deliberate, drenched in poetry and cruelty, is inseparable from the image of Pinhead. His delivery is what made the character immortal, but that voice almost didn't make it into the final film. Early screenings left producers uneasy. Bradley's British accent, his theatrical tone, his philosophical cadence, they feared it was too intellectual for horror fans. A villain shouldn't quote scripture. He should growl, scream, tear. So they hired a voice actor. They dubbed over several scenes with a rougher, simpler tone, less priest, more beast. The results were embarrassing. Pinhead sounded generic. The power was gone. The stillness shattered. Barker listened, then fought back. He demanded the original voice be restored. Most of it was. But traces of the attempted dub still linger in early VHS transfers and alternate television edits. The version of Pinhead we know, measured, intelligent, terrifying without raising his voice, only exists because one man refused to compromise. And in a film obsessed with mutilation, the most violent cut of all would have been to its soul. Bonus fact: the Cenobites were never the villains. That was the point. Chains, hooks, mutilation, screams. It's easy to look at the Cenobites and see monsters, creatures summoned from hell to punish the guilty. But that's a human projection. It's not what they are. In Hellraiser, the Cenobites don't stalk. They don't hunt. They don't kill out of vengeance. They come when they are called, and they bring exactly what was asked for. Frank wasn't taken by accident. He sought them out. He wanted more sensation, more experience, more everything. The Cenobites simply delivered, without hate, without cruelty, just precision. Clive Barker has said it many times. They're not evil. They're explorers. They've gone further than anyone else was willing to go. They represent the collapse of boundaries, between pain and pleasure, between desire and destruction, between self and surrender. So who's the villain? The Cenobites, who follow rules, who keep their word, who only act when summoned. Or the humans who betray, who kill, who open the box out of greed, then scream for mercy? Maybe Hellraiser was never a horror film. Maybe it was a mirror. And if the Cenobites terrify you, it's worth asking what part of you they reflect. So now you've seen what hides beneath the chains and leather, the lost footage, the buried truths, the voice that nearly vanished, and a villain who was never supposed to be one. But now it's your turn to open the box.